What are the fundamental ingredients a society needs to have to deliver broad prosperity, political stability, and a relatively high quality of life? Not just for elites, but for everyone. Well, what if I told you there's actually a framework that explains all of this, and even predicted the moment that we're in right now? The answers don't come from a pundit or a political party. They come from a sweeping study of civilization itself by a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama. If you've ever wondered why nothing is working, this video is going to give you the clearest explanation you've ever heard. I'm going to condense 1,300 pages of political theory down to what I hope is under 30 minutes. So according to Fukuyama, there are 3 core institutions that determine whether a society can produce that kind of broad economic prosperity and political stability. They are a sufficiently developed state, the rule of law, and a government that can be held accountable. And this next part blew my mind when I first read it, because it explains so much about why modern democracies thrive or fail. It's not just about having all 3. It's about the order in which they develop. So stick around to the end, because if you really understand these institutions, how they developed, what it takes to get them and keep them, you'll begin to get a picture of what it's going to take to fix what's broken in the United States. So Francis Fukuyama is not your average everyday political scientist. You might have heard of him because of his 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, where he predicted liberal democracy was the final form of government. That didn't exactly age well. But what's more interesting is what he did next. Instead of doubling down on ideology, he zoomed out even further, asking not what kind of government wins, but what makes any kind of government actually work. So he turned to history. Big history. And while most modern political science focuses on narrow trends like voter turnout or tweaks to institutional design, Fukuyama blends history, anthropology, political theory, and economics to ask more sweeping questions about how societies form, function, and fall apart. His most influential works, The Origins of Political Order and its sequel, Political Order and Political Decay, span 1,300 pages. And together they offer kind of a storybook tour through human civilization, from tribal societies and ancient empires to medieval kingdoms to modern states like China, Germany, and the United States. You've probably seen these books sitting on my desk in past videos, and I didn't leave them there just for show. I find these books fascinating. They explore questions like, what was the first society in the world to create what we think of as a professional government, complete with civil service exams, tax collectors, and a centralized leadership? Why did the Mafia emerge in southern Italy, but not the north? Why Catholic priests were finally banned from marrying and having children in the 11th century, and how that helped give rise to the rule of law itself. Out of this vast journey through political evolution, he teases out those 3 core institutions that every successful society has managed to develop. In the next part of this video, we're going to break those down. You'll get a deeper sense of what they are and why we developed them in the first place. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the order these institutions developed in matters, and why it helps explain America's dysfunction today. So before we dive into these institutions, there's one more thing Fukuyama says you need to understand: our biology. We evolved from primates, and for most of human history, we lived in tribal, clan-based societies. I probably don't need to explain that we're hardwired to take care of our own. It's in our DNA. And in a kin-based world, resources, protection, and loyalty all stay in the family. Fukuyama calls it a tyranny of cousins. In other words, you're not sharing your berries with strangers. But at a few key moments in history, some groups broke out of that pattern. They built impersonal institutions, systems that were larger than family, fairer than loyalty, and strong enough to hold together millions of strangers. Let's break them down. Number 1, a functioning state. This isn't about a flag or a president. A state is the professional system that actually gets things done. It mobilizes armies, builds roads, collects taxes, enforces laws, and delivers services. A strong state has capacity and it can execute. And the first place Fukuyama found this in history might surprise you. But before we go there, let's move to the second institution. Number 2, the rule of law. This one goes deeper than just laws exist. True rule of law means no one, not even the ruler, is above it. And it's also the foundation of basic personal security. Think Maslow's hierarchy. People need to feel safe walking down the streets, and a criminal justice system helps provide that. But it goes much further. The rule of law is actually the bedrock of a functioning economy. It also ensures that property rights are protected. You'll invest in that next herd of sheep knowing it won't be seized by the king. And contracts get enforced, so merchants can trade, build, and settle disputes without resorting to violence and chaos. It's what gives people the confidence to transact, to build, and to take risk. It actually takes a ton of time and resources to build. Literacy, law schools, court systems across the land. And in places where the rule of law is weak, economies stay stuck. And the third essential political institution is an accountable government. This is the feedback loop. It's how people check power through elections, protest, or public pressure. Accountability makes leaders responsive, and it creates consequences when they fail. And perhaps most importantly, it allows a society to peacefully replace its leaders when they're not performing. Today, we associate this with democracy. But even before democratic elections, some societies developed surprisingly strong mechanisms to hold leaders in check. So what happens when a country gets all of these institutions right? You get peace, political stability, economic prosperity, and a government that's not just working for the elites. And who do political scientists think is the poster child for this? Denmark. It has a strong, capable state that delivers services and collects taxes efficiently. It ranks #1 globally for rule of law and lack of corruption in government. And it's considered a full democracy with functioning accountability mechanisms, unlike the US, which has been downgraded in global rankings as a flawed democracy. On top of that, Denmark scores sky high on voter trust. And the result? Some of the best public health outcomes you can find. A per capita GDP at around $80,000 a year, almost identical to the US. And a population consistently ranked among the happiest in the world. Denmark is not perfect, but it shows what's possible when the system works. But here's the thing. Most countries never get to Denmark. And even the ones that do don't always stay there, because institutions can rot from the inside out. When even one pillar weakens, things start to break. Trust erodes, corruption creeps in, societies start to backslide. And some places are more vulnerable to that than others. Because here's that twist Fukuyama found that just blew my mind. It's not just what you build, it's when you build it. Some countries built strong states first and then layered in democracy after. That sequencing helped them resist corruption and cronyism. Others did democracy before building strong, capable institutions. And when that happens, politicians often fall back on those same ancient instincts, rewarding friends, donors, and loyalists. Sound familiar? Fukuyama has a name for that, and we'll get to it. But first, let's bring these three institutions to life with some crazy stories from history, starting with where the first modern state emerged. So when you think about large-scale systems that can actually do things, you might think of a global corporation like Walmart. Massive, efficient, and everywhere. But the first real modern centralized entity with serious operational and logistics muscle didn't emerge in the West, or in the last 300 years. In 221 BCE, 338 years before Rome reached its peak, China, under the Qin and later the Han dynasties, built what we now recognize as the first modern professional state. They brought under central command a vast geography. Between these two dynasties, they kept it relatively stable for 400 years. And why did they do that? Well, because they couldn't afford not to. Before China was unified under the Qin came the Warring States period, which saw 7 kingdoms locked in a brutal non-stop war for more than 2 centuries. During that period, 468 wars took place. Entire male populations were mobilized for battle. Kingdoms had to raise huge armies, build infrastructure, and coordinate military supply chains across vast distances. So what emerged wasn't just a kingdom, it was a centralized state that spanned 1.2 million square miles and governed up to 60 million people at the height of the Han dynasty. To hold that huge geography together, they built infrastructure that was mind-blowing for its time. Over 4,000 miles of roads, a courier system, and they imposed a single legal code, and they built the first part of the Great Wall of China. To make all of it work, you couldn't leave it up to chance. They needed a strong impersonal bureaucracy because the stakes were high. They needed people who could be trusted to execute, not just somebody's third cousin handed a title. So they created the world's first merit-based civil service, standardized exams, consistent hiring practices, clear hierarchies, and central decision-making. Jobs didn't go just to your uncle, for the most part anymore. They went to somebody who could do the work. And by the year 5 BCE, there were 130,000 professional bureaucrats in place. A state, in Fukuyama's terms, is a centralized authority that can execute at scale, and that requires talent. And the trade-off for talent is sometimes family loyalty. Probably anybody with a family business understands how rare it is that you really have the capacity, skill, and drive in the next generation to keep it running just the way you did. Similarly, a true state is impersonal. It doesn't reward family and friends. It runs best on rules, merit, and hardcore skills. And that's what made China's development so revolutionary. These new structures let China hold together a huge, diverse empire. Not just under the Qin, but especially under the Han, which institutionalized the system and kept it going for 4 centuries. They retained the bureaucratic model, expanded civil service, and governed a territory the size of the Roman Empire. And the enterprise endured because it returned something of value to the people: order, infrastructure, and a functioning state. Fast forward to modern times. One universal truth remains. A government can't deliver public goods if it can't fund itself. Taxes aren't just a nuisance, they're really the lifeblood of a functioning state. Now, we all joke that the only things certain in life are death and taxes. But the ability to actually collect those taxes, that's no joke. It's one of the clearest markers of state capacity. In places like Somalia, the country can barely fund itself, and it suffers for it. But even in modern-day Greece, an estimated 40% of taxes go uncollected. That's not just a revenue gap, it's a failure of governance. Without predictable funding, a government can't plan, invest, or deliver the kinds of public infrastructure that support economic growth and trade. And correspondingly, Greece has one of the weakest economies in Europe. Greece's GDP per capita sits about 30% below the EU average. Now compare that to the US, where we collect almost 90% of taxes owed. For all our dysfunction, that's a serious indicator of administrative capacity. And the biggest expansion of state power and taxes in US history, well, it wasn't that different from China, because ours came during the buildup to World War II. In just a couple years, the US built tons of thousands of tanks, ships, and planes. It created industrial cities from scratch. It coordinated rationing, price controls, global supply chains. It even funded the Manhattan Project in total secrecy. And that's what real state capacity looks like: planning, mobilizing, and delivering at massive scale, and fast. But here's what Fukuyama warns about. Capacity without constraint can become dangerous. Even China's early bureaucratic system, pioneered by the Qin and institutionalized by the Han, eventually decayed. The Qin, for all their innovation, ruled through brutal totalitarianism and was quickly overthrown. Authoritarianism, for all its vigor, isn't actually that stable, it turns out. The Han were more moderate and carried those forms forward for centuries. But even so, over time, merit gave way to favoritism. Positions once earned through talent were filled through connections. And the system that once delivered public order began serving private interests. Because while China had a strong state, it never developed institutions like rule of law or democratic accountability. And that's the paradox Fukuyama underscores. The stronger your state becomes, the more essential it is to pair it with other institutions that can keep it from drifting into decay. So how the heck did humans ever develop a force powerful enough to constrain rulers? It certainly wasn't what you'd expect. One of the strongest forces holding rulers in check in medieval Europe wasn't a constitution or a parliament or even the people. It was actually the Catholic Church. The church acted as a kind of transnational institution that even monarchs had to answer to, reinforcing the idea that no one, not even a king, was above the law. After the fall of Rome, the church asserted its own independent authority, building legal systems and canon law that even kings were expected to respect. But how did a religious institution get that strong in the first place? Well, this is a wild story. Did you know that for over 1,000 years, Catholic priests could marry and have kids? And what does that have to do with the rule of law? Well, think back to that pesky thing about DNA and kinship, about who we instinctively want to share power and resources with. Well, in the early centuries of the church, priests owned land and passed it to their sons. And so they had a lot of incentive to get all wrapped up in local politics. That is, until Pope Gregory VII changed everything with the Gregorian reform in the 11th century. He banned marriage and enforced celibacy amongst priests, not for moral reasons, but to sever those kinship ties and redirect loyalty back to the church, just like many other empires did when they used eunuchs as officials who had no family interests to protect. The idea was simple. If priests couldn't pass power to their sons, their loyalty would shift back to the institution. It was a power move to create a more loyal and impersonal bureaucracy. And that move transformed the Catholic Church into a true centralized state-like force, independent from kings, loyal to Rome, and capable of enforcing a universal moral order. And this gave Europe something radical, a countervailing institution that served as a check on royal power. Even monarchs had to answer to that higher law. And in that way, the Catholic Church became sort of a protective factor for society. Long before constitutions, people understood that rulers had to answer to something higher. That idea that no one is above the law paved the way for constitutional government itself. So that's the first part of the rule of law, the idea that no ruler is above it. But what about the other pieces that have to do with security, justice, and the foundation of our economy? Well, for that, let's stay on the Italian peninsula. I'm going to take you to southern Italy in the 1860s and tell you a story about lemons, land, and La Cosa Nostra. After the Kingdom of Italy was officially unified in 1861, politicians in the north hoped the country would finally function like one nation. But when northern officials arrived in the south, they were stunned at what they found. The new governor of Naples, freshly installed by Giuseppe Garibaldi, wrote to the prime minister, Cavour, "This is not Italy. This is Africa." Now yes, that quote is wildly condescending, but it wasn't just bigotry. It was a comment on political institutions, or rather, the lack of them. Because while Piedmont in the north had slowly built a functioning state with courts, bureaucracy, and some rule of law, the south had nothing of the sort. And not because its people were backward. It failed to do that because for 500 years it was ruled by outsiders. The Spanish Habsburgs, then the Bourbons. Courts weren't local, and all government meant was foreign troops and taxes. So when Italy unified in 1861, the South lacked legal infrastructure, and trust only flowed between family and friends. What it had was lemons, landowners, and a low-trust society, and a lot of contracts to enforce. Because at this time, the southern economy was entering a boom, especially in Sicily, where citrus exports were taking off. Lemons and oranges became big business. But that meant contracts, property rights, and protections suddenly mattered a whole lot more. And here's the thing. When money shows up before institutions do, you get what scholars like Diego Gambetta call a protection market. In countries where the rule of law is strong, the state holds a monopoly on legitimate violence to enforce laws and keep order. But in Sicily, that job got outsourced. If your lemon harvest was stolen or your contract was breached, you didn't turn to the police or the courts. You paid a local mafioso. As Diego Gambetta put it, the mafia was an industry, a private business that produced and sold protection. In other words, it arose as a firm that enforced property rights where the state failed to do so. But here's the problem. If the state fails to hold a monopoly on both civil and criminal law, and the mafia becomes the middleman for every transaction, things start to spiral. Because the same guy who enforces your contract can also extort you. He's the cop and the criminal. And once you're in that world, you don't get out of it without more violence. This is what happens without the rule of law. That kind of system can create order to an extent, but it cannot deliver justice, and definitely not growth. You can't scale capitalism when deals get enforced with baseball bats. And if you don't want to live under conditions like that, what's the way to change them? It's not like you can vote out your friendly local mafia boss. And so, under every regime, even national ones, unless there's a peaceful path to check authority, we're just looking at more violence. And you're just not on the path to peace, stability, and prosperity. Which is why the third political institution is an absolutely essential ingredient if that's what we're after. So we've talked about the state and the power to act, and we've talked about the rule of law, the power that constrains. But the third political institution? This one's about you. Because the most important question any system has to answer isn't just can it act or can it be fair, it's can it fix itself when it's not delivering? And that's right at the heart of what political theorists call accountability, the idea that people in power can be held responsible for how they perform. And if they fail, you can help remove them peacefully. Because when accountability works, it creates a virtuous cycle. Leaders respond to public needs, trust grows, stability and investment follow, and society itself gets stronger. And perhaps no moment captured that idea better than what happened in 1688 when England fired its king.
You're fired. Go.
After years of civil war, a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, and a monarch who wouldn't play by the rules, Parliament did the unthinkable. They invited a new king, William of Orange, to take the throne. But only under strict conditions. No more absolute monarchy. Parliament controlled the spending. And so for the first time in England, the power of the state had to formally answer to a body made up of the people. It wasn't democracy yet, but it was a breakthrough. A peaceful transfer of power based on performance. But if you want perhaps a more extreme version of accountability, let's rewind to 5th century Athens, the birthplace of democracy. Athenian citizens didn't just vote directly on every single piece of legislation. They designed an absolutely brutal system for keeping leaders accountable. They didn't actually have elections, just lotteries to assign official roles, which was a way to stop elites from hoarding power. But once a year, they held a vote to ostracize any politician who had grown too powerful or corrupt. No trial, no appeal, just 10 years of exile. Was that extreme? Sure. But it worked because it sent a message. Leaders are temporary, the people endure, and you better respond to them. And this kind of feedback loop, it's actually the secret sauce to good government. If leaders know they can be replaced, they perform, or you'll find someone who will. But if there's no peaceful off-ramp for a bad leader, well, you're living in a powder keg, which brings me right up to the American Revolution. Now, if you're still watching this video, thank you for sticking with me. We're almost to the part where this theory actually explains what's going wrong in America. But before we go there, let's just take a step back and talk about American government structure, how the founders actually designed it. They had just fought a war to escape a king, so the last thing they wanted was to accidentally build a new one. Everything they designed in the Constitution was meant to keep power from piling up in one place. So they split it 6 ways from Sunday across 3 branches and between federal and state governments. And then just for fun, they threw in the necessary and proper clause just to blur the lines even more. You can watch my federalism video linked down below if you want to know more about that. And when it comes to our 3 core political institutions, America is basically accountability on steroids. From day one, it's been big on checks, big on law, but pretty weak on execution and the power of the state. It's the classic Jefferson versus Hamilton divide. But now we're getting the part that when I first learned about it completely blew my mind because it explains so much about what's broken in American government right now. In his grand tour of political history, Fukuyama noticed something crucial. The order in which societies developed these institutions mattered a lot. And once you see it, you'll never look at what's wrong with American politics the same way again. Because what's happening now is completely predictable. In the nations that had democracy first, prior to building the apparatus of a modern state, you know that hardwired human tendency of ours to share only with our friends and family? Well, that thing comes springing back to life so fast you won't even know what hit you. Take Andrew Jackson, America's first populist president. He had a legitimate stated goal, to shake up political offices and fill them with his loyalists. It's certainly something we're not unfamiliar with today. And for anybody who's ever managed anything, you can understand the logic of that. But there's also a catch. You see, these offices could then be used as a basis for mobilizing political supporters. And that part makes sense too. After the vote expanded to non-property holders in the 1820s, political participation surged, and the parties needed ways to mobilize these new voters. As Fukuyama says, although programmatic issues such as tariffs or land rights were important to some voters, the promise of a job or a personal favor was a much more effective means of activating a new class of poor and relatively uneducated voters. So, after Andrew Jackson introduced what became known as the spoils system, government jobs became political rewards, handed out based on loyalty rather than merit. A practice epitomized by Tammany Hall at the local level in New York. But after President James Garfield was assassinated in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker, public outrage led to the Pendleton Act, which created a professional civil service and began rolling back patronage politics in the US. Fukuyama realized that when you have the chance to build a strong, professional, highly functional state first, even under an authoritarian, it sort of inoculates you against this kind of abuse of democracy, which is where you're trading access for political support. Many modern democracies, like Germany, Sweden, and Japan, inherited strong professional states from monarchies. The state came first and democracy got layered on top. And that made them more resistant to that ancient human pull, because the impersonal machinery of government was already running before people got the power to steer it. But America did the opposite. We built a government based on checks and balances and representation before we ever built a professional bureaucracy. And in countries that followed that same path, like most everybody in post-independence Latin America, Nigeria, or post-colonial India, you see the same pattern. Democratic accountability without a strong, well-developed state leads straight back into patronage. That ancient instinct kicks in and we fall back on what we know. Friends, family, and favors. And before you know it, government isn't about rules and merit anymore. It's about who you know and what you can buy. Fukuyama calls this regression, repatrimonialization. It's safe to say that with modern lobbying and the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which blew the lid off of money and politics, we're experiencing an amplified version of it now. But here's what Fukuyama says is just as dangerous. It's not just that the American state is captured, it's that it's weak to begin with. Because the Founding Fathers leaned so hard on accountability, checks and balances, and division of power, the state itself is often completely disabled from taking action in the common interest. Fukuyama explains it in a great way.
And so if you ask, why is it that high-speed rail doesn't exist today? There's zoning and permitting requirements. We in California have something called the California Environmental Quality Act that allows all 40 million citizens of California to sue anything they want with no statute of limitations. And as a result, you have a lot of veto points built into the way we make decisions and very little to force something that's in the collective interest, like high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco.
And I've seen this excess of veto points with my own eyes. Picture this. I'm working at a local housing authority, funded by federal public housing dollars. And we wanted to install a playground at a property we owned, one that had a ton of kids living there. We had the public money, we had the great team, we were ready to go. But the whole project got stuck for nearly 3 years because of environmental reviews, carried out by a completely separate branch of government that was regulating us. And by the time we got clearance, a couple of classrooms worth of kids had already aged out of being able to use it. And when these kinds of blocks pile up, when they lead to housing crises, the gutting of public safety, the decay of public education, that's when voters start looking for anyone who promises to get things done, and by any means necessary. If this video helped you see things a little differently or made you think, I hope you'll stick around. Hit subscribe if you want to be a part of this conversation, and I'll see you on the next video.